The aroma of bacon and fresh coffee, a familiar comfort, clung to the air of Grant's Diner. It was Sunday, 8:30 a.m., and in Grant's Diner, a small town nestled in the heart of rural America, Sunday morning had a rhythm all its own. The booths, upholstered in worn but cheerful red vinyl, were filling fast. Retirees, their faces etched with the stories of decades, occupied the prime spots, discussing sermons and grandchildren. Churchgoers, still in their Sunday best, lingered over pancakes, their voices a soft murmur. A handful of regulars, the kind who didn't need menus and whose orders were known by heart, sat at the counter, exchanging knowing glances with the staff. The gentle hum of laughter, the rhythmic clink of forks on ceramic plates, and the melancholic twang of old country tunes from a dusty speaker in the corner wove together into a tapestry of mundane, comforting sounds. Signs, hand-taped to every window, proudly proclaimed Veterans Discount Day. Half off for proof of service. A small American flag pin, slightly tarnished, sat clipped to the hostess stand, a silent sentinel. At one large table, a boisterous group had already cleared their plates, their voices rising in a chorus of exaggerated war stories that may or may not have ever happened, their laughter echoing a little too loudly in the cozy space. But in the back corner, tucked away beside the exit sign, sat a man who seemed to exist outside the diner's comfortable chaos. He was thin, almost gaunt, with a shock of snow-white hair that suggested age more than it did infirmity. A brown coat, worn smooth by too many winters, hung loosely on his frame. Beneath frayed jeans, a dull metal prosthetic leg peeked out, a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere. His name, though few knew it, was Walter Reed. Walter didn't wear medals. There was no ball cap embroidered with the names of forgotten units or distant wars. He hadn't spoken a single word since he arrived, save for his order, the veteran special, scrambled eggs and toast. No substitutions. He sat alone, as he always did on these Veterans Day Sundays. From my vantage point behind the counter, a perpetually damp towel slung over my shoulder, I could see the way he held his glass of water, both hands wrapped around it as if steadying himself against an invisible tremor. He radiated a profound stillness, a quietude that seemed to absorb all sound, leaving an almost unsettling void around him. What truly caught most people's attention wasn't his silence, though. It was the tattoo. Faded and warped by time and the sun, it rested on his left wrist, a dagger crossed through an anchor. Nothing fancy, barely legible, its lines blurred into the canvas of his aged skin. It was the kind of ink people used to get in makeshift barracks bathrooms, back before the digital world came along to document every fleeting moment, every spontaneous decision. It bespoke a different era, a different kind of life. A group of 4 men, late 40s, all sporting identical, slightly too tight golf jackets, occupied the central booth. They were the kind of men who commanded attention simply by their volume. They noticed Walter immediately. One nudged the others, a smirk playing on his lips, nodding subtly towards Walter's solitary table. "I bet he drew that thing on himself," he snickered, his voice carrying just a little too far. "Looks like a middle school dare, doesn't it?" Another leaned in, his own smirk widening. "What kind of vet doesn't even have a service ID? Probably just looking for a free meal." Their laughter, not quite loud enough to be an outright disturbance, but certainly loud enough to be heard, rippled through their table. I froze at my station, a stack of menus in my hand. I didn't know Walter's story. None of us did. He was a creature of habit. He came in every year on this specific day, sat in the same spot, ordered the same meager meal, offered a quiet, "thank you," left a single dollar on the table, and then disappeared back into the anonymous flow of life. He never made a fuss. He never asked for anything. And maybe that's precisely why it hurt to watch him become the butt of someone else's cruel joke. I wasn't the only one who heard them. The quiet hum of the diner had subtly shifted, becoming strained, hesitant. Walter didn't flinch, didn't even lift his head. His eyes remained fixed on his glass of water, his knuckles white around it. The corners of his mouth were drawn tight, pulled into an expression you couldn't quite name. Not shame, not sadness, but something far heavier, a profound weariness, perhaps, or the quiet resignation of someone who had seen too much, felt too much, and simply had no more fight left for petty insults. Then, Todd, the manager, materialized at Walter's table. His plastic customer service smile was firmly in place, but his eyes darted nervously around the room, betraying a flicker of discomfort. "Sir," he said, his voice polite but firm, resonating with a faint edge of impatience. "We've had a couple of complaints. Some of the other guests feel uncomfortable. Would you mind relocating to the patio seating?" The room didn't go completely quiet, but something profoundly changed in the air. The clatter of forks seemed to cease. The low murmur of conversation faltered. I stopped wiping the counter, my towel suspended in midair. Walter said nothing. He simply offered the slightest nod, not out of agreement, but out of that same deep resignation. The kind of nod you give when you've had this exact conversation too many times to count, when resistance is futile and simply too exhausting. He began to gather his tray, balancing it precariously in one hand while his other gripped the worn handle of his cane. His walk was slow, each step a deliberate negotiation between the invisible pain he carried and the last vestiges of his dignity. The dull metal of his prosthetic leg creaked audibly with every movement, a forlorn protest. As he shuffled past the central table, one of the men, emboldened by Todd's intervention, raised his coffee mug again. "If he's a SEAL, I must be the president," he declared loudly, and the table erupted in another roar of laughter, a triumphant, ugly sound. And that's when it happened. A single, crystalline tear detached itself from Walter's lower eyelid, rolled down his weathered cheek, and dropped silently to the tile floor, disappearing instantly. Nobody said anything. Nobody tried to stop him. I looked at Todd. He didn't move, just turned away, pretending he had other tables to check, other duties to attend to. Walter made it to the glass door, struggled for a moment with the handle, then stepped out into the cold, unforgiving light of late autumn. The wind hit him full in the face. He squinted, scanning the empty patio, before finally settling at a small, isolated table near the edge, his back to the warmth he'd been denied. One hand remained on his cane, the other carefully setting down a plate of now cold scrambled eggs. Back inside, the artificial comfort of the diner quickly returned. Customers resumed sipping their refills. The men at the center table laughed again, softer now, but still laced with smug satisfaction. I didn't know what to do. I was new to this job, still in high school. They told me to smile, refill coffee, and stay out of customer disputes. But something about that man, something about the way he absorbed the humiliation as if it were a routine, an expected part of his day, made my throat ache with a fierce, unfamiliar pain. I kept glancing towards the window, a magnetic pull drawing my eyes to Walter. He sat alone, shoulders hunched slightly, the steam from his coffee rising rapidly, carried away by the cold wind swirling around him. A veteran, clearly, but without fanfare, without documentation, without defense. He wasn't invisible. People saw him. They just chose not to truly look. Then, at precisely 8:46 a.m., the bell over the door jingled once more. A young man stepped inside. Black jacket, tight military-style haircut, his posture ramrod straight. He was perhaps in his late 20s, early 30s at most. No smile, no hesitation, just a quiet, self-possessed presence that seemed to make people step out of his way without even realizing they had. He scanned the room with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, then his gaze locked on to the empty seat where Walter had been. From there, his eyes flickered to the window, then to the tattoo, still visible, still unmistakable, resting against the old man's wrist as he finally, slowly, began to steady his fork, attempting to eat. And the young man stopped cold. His jaw tightened, a sharp intake of breath. The entire room fell silent, as if someone had unplugged the jukebox, as if every fork in the place had frozen halfway to someone's mouth. Because this young soldier wasn't just looking. He was recognizing. And what he saw on that old man's wrist wasn't just a faded tattoo. It was history. It was brotherhood. It was a story only some men were ever meant to know, a secret language etched in skin and memory. And he was about to tell all of us. Jackson Miles didn't move. Not at first. His polished black boots remained planted just inside the entrance of Grant's diner, as if gravity had suddenly grabbed hold of him and wouldn't let go. His eyes, sharp, trained, relentless, were fixed on that tattoo, the one on the old man's wrist, the dagger through the anchor. It was an emblem no ordinary sailor would know. It wasn't on recruitment posters. It never showed up on regulation uniforms. It belonged to a unit so specialized, so shrouded in secrecy, that most files about them were still heavily redacted after 50 years. And only 8 men in history had ever worn that exact mark. Only 8. Jackson took a slow step forward, then another, his presence drawing all eyes like a magnet. The comfortable buzz of conversation that had filled the diner minutes ago had vanished, replaced by an almost palpable tension. Even the coffee machine seemed to hiss a little quieter. All eyes followed the young man in uniform as he walked past the booths, past the counter where I stood, past the table of 4 men who had done all the mocking. His stride was deliberate, unhurried, yet filled with an undeniable sense of purpose. When he reached the window and looked outside at Walter, the wind caught the door for a second. It slammed shut behind him with a sudden, jarring sound that made everyone inside jump. My heart hammered hard against my ribs. Walter Reed hadn't noticed him yet. He was still sitting at the edge of the patio, his back slightly hunched, one hand on his cane, the other idly resting on his plate. The eggs were untouched, the steam gone. He looked like someone who had learned to make himself smaller just to survive the harsh realities of the world. Jackson opened the door to the patio and stepped out. He stopped precisely 2 feet from Walter's table. Then he stood tall, ramrod straight, shoulders squared, and raised his hand in a perfect, crisp salute. "Sir," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone inside to hear, ringing with an unwavering clarity that cut through the silence. "Are you Walter Reed of SEAL Team Bravo?" Walter looked up slowly, confusion clouding his features. The wind, as if on cue, momentarily lifted his coat, fully revealing the tattoo on his wrist, its faded lines suddenly stark against his skin. Jackson's voice cracked just slightly when he spoke again, a tremor of awe. "G7, isn't it, sir? You're the one they tell us about in training." Walter blinked, stunned. His lips parted, but no words came out. His hand tightened around his cane, the only outward sign of his shock. Then, finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Jackson didn't lower his salute. His voice dropped, becoming softer, but it still carried, imbued with a profound respect. "Permission to sit, sir?" Walter, still bewildered, motioned to the chair across from him. "Of course, son." Jackson lowered his arm and sat, still stiff, still visibly trembling with a reverence that seemed almost religious. Inside the diner, no one moved. Not the servers, not the guests, not even the 4 men at the center booth, whose earlier laughter had now curdled into a pale, awkward silence. Todd, the manager, stood halfway between the counter and the register, his face drained of all color, his usual composure completely gone. And me? I was frozen in place, my heart thudding in my chest, because I had heard that name before. Walter Reed. G7. That wasn't just a nickname. It was a code designation, whispered like a legend around the SEAL training camps, stories passed down from generation to generation of elite soldiers. The man who once coordinated extractions under heavy fire with no radio contact. The logistics technician who, against all odds, saved 17 lives during Operation Swift Current, an impossible mission in the heart of enemy territory. The one whose records were still classified because no one could figure out how he had pulled it off, how he had orchestrated such feats of impossible bravery and tactical genius. I only knew because of my grandfather, James Harrington. He used to tell me bedtime stories that didn't feel like stories until I was old enough to realize they were vivid, painful memories. And in every single one of them, there was a quiet man with a wrist tattoo who never said much, but always got them home. I never thought I'd see him in real life, but here he was, right outside the window, with rain threatening in the distance, and a young soldier sitting across from him like he was meeting royalty. Jackson turned slightly in his seat, his voice still audible, his words cutting through the lingering tension in the diner. "This man," he said, his gaze sweeping over the awestruck faces inside, designed extraction protocols we still use today. He helped build our standard operating procedures for field supply drops. That tattoo? It was earned in blood, not bought, not claimed. His eyes then locked onto the men at the center table, burning with a cold fire. "If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend," he said firmly, his voice low and dangerous, "maybe you should be the ones eating outside." One of the men shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado completely deflated. Another cleared his throat, his face flushing, and stood up, leaving his plate half-eaten. Then another followed. By the time Jackson turned his attention back toward Walter, only 2 of the 4 remained, their eyes locked on their coffee mugs, burning with a searing, unspoken shame. Walter didn't say much. He never did. But his lips pressed together in a line that almost, just almost, resembled a smile. The kind of smile that carried the weight of 50 years of silence, of battles fought and sacrifices made in obscurity. I don't remember making the conscious decision to move, but suddenly I was at the door, stepping outside with a fresh pot of coffee in my hand. The cool air brushed against my face, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. I poured a cup for Walter without a word, the familiar scent of coffee a small comfort in the surreal moment. Then I looked at Jackson. "Would you like some too?" "Yes, ma'am," he said softly, his voice still tinged with awe. "Thank you." He took the cup with both hands, reverently, as if it were something sacred, a tangible connection to the man before him. I stood there for a moment, the coffee pot feeling heavy in my hand, not knowing what to say, what to do. Then, I did something I had never planned to do, something impulsive and deeply personal. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I'd kept it there since this morning, one of the old notes my grandfather had meticulously written in his worn field journal. Tucked inside was a faded photograph. It showed two young men in jungle gear, grinning like fools, standing near a rusted truck, their youth stark against the backdrop of war. One of them was Grandpa James. The other, unmistakably, had a dagger and anchor tattoo on his wrist. I unfolded the photo and gently set it down on the table in front of Walter. He froze. His eyes, though still clouded by a hint of confusion, scanned the image. Then he slowly lifted his gaze to me. And for a moment, just a moment, his whole face shifted. The weariness seemed to lift, replaced by a flicker of something akin to recognition, a faint light in his ancient eyes, as if he'd stumbled upon a forgotten piece of his own soul. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, raspy with disuse. "James Harrington," I replied, my own voice trembling slightly. Walter blinked. Once, then twice. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, profound exhalation escaping his lips. "He promised me once," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the photo, "he'd buy the first burger when we got home." I smiled gently, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "He talked about you. He always said you were the reason they made it back." Walter looked at the photo again, then at me, his gaze surprisingly direct. "You have his eyes." A lump rose in my throat, thick and painful. Jackson said nothing, just watched us quietly, respectfully. He knew this wasn't a moment to interrupt, but to bear witness. And then, without asking, without warning, he stood up and raised his phone. He snapped a single photo. Walter, the tattoo, the coffee cup, the folded photograph on the table, me standing beside him. Just a quiet scene on a quiet Sunday morning in a nowhere town. But Jackson knew what he was doing. By that night, the image would be everywhere. Millions of people would see it. Some would share it. Some would cry. Some would ask how they'd never heard of Walter Reed before. And maybe for the first time in half a century, the world would finally see what it had almost forgotten. Not just the man, but what he stood for. By Monday morning, the photo had gone viral. Not because of fancy editing. Not because it was staged, but because it was real. Because someone, somewhere, saw a young Navy SEAL saluting an old man with a faded tattoo, a coffee cup between them, a folded photograph, and a girl in an apron standing nearby with tears in her eyes. The caption was simple, stark in its profound truth. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. Some still carry the mission. I didn't even know Jackson had posted it. He hadn't told anyone. But the internet moved fast, faster than memory, faster than shame, faster than people could explain how they'd missed it for so long. Walter Reed became a name again, echoing across digital landscapes. Local news picked it up first, a heartwarming story about a veteran discovered. Then regional. By Wednesday, there were camera crews outside Grant's Diner, their bright lights and microphones invading our quiet town, asking for interviews. Todd, the same manager who'd asked Walter to sit outside, became a master of evasion, dodging questions like he was allergic to accountability. But me? I talked. I told them what I saw, what I felt, what I'd nearly stayed silent about. And when they asked who Walter Reed was, I didn't quote his rank or his war record. I just said, my voice clear and steady, he's the kind of man who never asked for anything and deserves everything. The rest, as they say, unfolded on its own, a quiet revolution sparked by a single image. Letters started arriving by Friday. At first, just a few, handwritten, mostly from veterans. Mostly from people who said things like, I served in NM. I remember G7 stories. I thought they were legend. Or, my dad told me about a man who pulled 3 soldiers from a burning truck. I think that was your Walter. Then came the school children. Dozens of envelopes, all sealed with scotch tape and crooked handwriting, filled with crayon drawings of a smiling old man with a tattoo on his wrist. One read, in careful block letters, Dear Mr. Reed, my grandpa cried when he saw your picture. He said you were the reason he came home. Walter didn't know what to do with them at first. He brought a stack into the diner, his brow furrowed in confusion, and handed them to me. You'll know what to do, he said, his voice a quiet rumble. I made copies, framed a few, and posted one on the bulletin board with a simple, heartfelt note. If you know Walter, say thank you. The next day, a woman left flowers outside his usual patio table, a single daisy and a napkin that said, in delicate script, we see you now. The town, it seemed, was slowly, quietly, beginning to awaken. 2 weeks later, I got a call from City Hall. They wanted Walter to speak at the Veterans Day ceremony. The mayor's office, sensing the shift in the town's sentiment, said it would mean a lot if someone like him, someone who represented the silent service, could offer a few words. I called him that night. He was quiet for a long time, the silence on the line stretching, heavy with unspoken memories. Finally, he said, his voice barely audible, "If it helps others feel remembered, I'll go." That Sunday, I stood at the back of the community auditorium, watching him walk up the steps to the podium. No uniform, no medals, just a clean button-down shirt, his prosthetic leg polished to a subtle sheen, and that tattoo still visible beneath the carefully rolled sleeve of his left arm. He stood behind the mic, a small, unassuming figure, and looked out at the packed room. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, a sea of expectant faces. He said only this: "I'm not a hero. I'm not a legend. I just did the right thing and tried to live quiet after. But if what I did helped someone, then I'd do it again tomorrow." That was it. He stepped back, and the entire room rose to its feet. Not because the speech was long, not because it was eloquent or filled with grand pronouncements, but because it was true. And truth, in its purest form, carries an immeasurable weight. The applause was deafening, a cascade of appreciation that lasted for minutes, a sound Walter had almost certainly never heard directed at himself before. He stood there, blinking, perhaps a little overwhelmed, but a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of satisfaction passed through him. After that day, something profound shifted in our town. You could feel it in the smallest things, the subtle changes that accumulate into something significant. People started waving to Walter on the street, not with a dismissive glance, but with genuine warmth. Kids, emboldened by their parents' stories, ran up to him outside the post office, their faces alight with curiosity, asking about his tattoo. Churches invited him to speak, not to preach, but simply to share, to be present. The auto shop he'd quietly run for 20 years, barely scraping by, suddenly had a waiting list. Cars lined up down the street, their owners patiently waiting for Walter to fix their engines, not just for his skill, but for the honor of his presence. One morning, a group of volunteers from the high school showed up with paint buckets and ladders, their youthful energy a sharp contrast to the shop's weathered facade. "We're here to clean up the place, sir," they announced, eager to help. Walter grumbled, a low, fond sound, but let them. The next week, someone replaced the squeaky gate out front with a sturdy, new one. Then someone fixed the leaking roof. Then a couple of grizzled veterans stopped by with brand new tools, shiny and unused. "Thought you could use these," they said, their voices gruff but kind. And Walter? He didn't ask for any of it. He just smiled, a softer, more frequent smile now, let them help, and got back to work, because that's who he was. He was a man of quiet action, not grand gestures. In late spring, the mayor made a significant announcement. They were installing a plaque at City Hall. A permanent marker set right beside the billowing American flag, a constant reminder. It bore a simple, yet profoundly moving engraving: "Honor the quiet ones. The ones who carried burdens we never saw. The ones who walked alone so others could come home." At the bottom, etched into the polished steel, was the unmistakable image of his tattoo, a dagger through an anchor. Walter stood beside it during the unveiling. No speech this time. He just touched the cold metal gently, his fingers tracing the familiar lines of his tattoo, and nodded. His eyes were wet, glistening in the sunlight, but no tears fell. They didn't need to. The sentiment was understood. And then came the day we didn't expect, but perhaps, in hindsight, should have anticipated. Walter's 85th birthday. It was meant to be quiet. He didn't want a party. Said he'd be perfectly fine with black coffee and toast, like always. But life, and a grateful town, had other plans. That morning, just before 9, I heard it. A low hum in the distance, growing steadily louder, then the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I stepped out of the diner just in time to see 3 black SUVs, gleaming in the morning sun, pull up in front of Walter's auto shop. And behind them, 2 military Humvees, their engines rumbling softly. 7 young men stepped out. Sharp haircuts, polished boots that gleamed, crisp navy dress uniforms, their bearing immaculate. Their faces were serious, solemn. And then, one more figure emerged from the back seat of the last SUV. Sarah Harrington, my cousin, my best friend, and the granddaughter of James Harrington. She was holding a small wooden box, polished smooth, and a meticulously folded American flag. Walter stepped out of the shop, wiping his hands with a rag, his brow furrowed in confusion. Until he saw them. Until he saw her. Sarah stepped forward first, her green eyes, so like her grandfather's, already glistening. "Hi," she said, her voice trembling slightly, charged with emotion. "You probably don't remember me." Walter blinked, then a faint light of recognition sparked in his eyes. "I do," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You have your grandfather's eyes." She smiled, tears already welling, spilling down her cheeks. "We came to honor your birthday," she said, her voice catching, "and to say thank you." Walter looked at the men behind her. One by one, they approached. Each stood at rigid attention. Each saluted, the crisp snap of their hands against their brows echoing in the quiet street. And then, without fanfare, without speeches, they handed him that small wooden box. Inside was a heavy medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation, engraved with his name, his designation, G7, and below that, a simple yet profound dedication, for service above silence. He whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought they'd forgotten." Sarah took his hand, her touch gentle. "We never did," she affirmed, her voice unwavering. Walter stood still, holding the medallion in both hands, his thumbs brushing lightly over the engraved words. The wind rustled gently through the trees above, a soft sigh. And for a moment, everything around us seemed to slow. No cars passed on the main street. No phones rang from within the diner. No one said a word, the silence a powerful testament to the moment. The 7 young SEALs stood silently behind Sarah, their uniforms immaculate, their eyes sharp, unwavering. But even they looked humbled, reverent, like they knew this wasn't just another ceremony. This was something deeper, quieter, sacred. Sarah stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, for his ears alone. "He would have been proud, you know." Walter looked up, his eyes searching hers, seeking confirmation. She smiled softly, fighting the tears rising in her throat. "My grandfather, James Harrington. He would have been proud to know I got to meet you, to stand here and say thank you, not just for him, but for all of us." Walter blinked slowly, once, then reached out and gently took her hand, his aged fingers closing around hers. "He was the best of us," he said, his voice raspy, thick with memories. Sarah nodded, a single tear escaping her eye. "So were you." The old man's eyes glistened, and for a second, just a fleeting moment, he looked not 85, but 25. Young again, strong, back in the jungle, back in the fire. Back when 8 men carried a promise, a burden, a sacred duty that only one had lived long enough to keep. And now, he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The weight had been shared, acknowledged, finally. That week, something fundamental changed in town. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It started with a proposal from the city council, brought forward by the mayor herself. A motion to rename the road where Walter's auto shop stood. Not after a politician, not after a developer, not after some historical figure, but after a man who never asked for his name to be known. 3 weeks later, a new sign was unveiled. White letters on a simple metal post. Nothing flashy. It read, "Silent Serviceway in honor of Walter Reed, SEAL Team Bravo. Honor the quiet ones." They didn't hold a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Walter wouldn't have liked that. Instead, they simply planted a small American flag beneath the sign and left it at that, a quiet, dignified tribute. Walter kept working at the shop after that. Slower than before, perhaps, his movements more deliberate, but still steady, still methodical. Neighbors stopped by more often, not just for tune-ups, but to sit, to listen, to learn. Kids brought drawings of the new street sign. Veterans, encouraged by the newfound recognition, brought old photos, tales of their own service, stories that had been locked away for decades. He rarely talked about himself, even now. But sometimes, if you caught him on a quiet afternoon, perhaps while he was meticulously tightening a lug nut or checking the oil, he'd tell you about the time a medevac was 3 minutes late and how he carried a man on his back across a field full of silence and smoke, the enemy close behind. He never called it heroism. He just called it finishing the job. That's how Walter lived. Until the day he didn't. 3 years later, on a crisp morning in late September, the flags at City Hall were lowered to half-staff. Walter Reed passed peacefully in his sleep. No pain, no noise, just silence. Like always. The town went still that day. Grant's Diner closed early, its red vinyl booths empty, the coffee machine quiet. The high school canceled its afternoon classes. And by noon, people had already begun gathering outside the small church on the edge of town, the one with peeling white paint and a steeple that leaned ever so slightly to the left. They came in work boots and military dress, in worn baseball caps and flowing choir robes, in old uniforms that hadn't been buttoned in decades but were now worn with quiet pride. They came because they knew what he carried, even if he never said it out loud. They came because they remembered. The funeral was simple, dignified, precisely as Walter would have wanted. A humble wooden casket, draped reverently in the American flag. At Walter's request, there were no eulogies, no elaborate slideshows of his life, no biographies read aloud to strangers. Just one song, Amazing Grace, played slow and low, like it had to tiptoe across the room, its mournful notes a tender caress. 6 active duty SEALs, including Jackson Miles, carried the casket. Each one had flown in from different corners of the country, leaving behind their duties, their families, their own lives. Not because they had to, not because they were ordered, but because when a man like Walter goes home, you show up. You always show up. Sarah Harrington, in the front pew, clutched the folded photograph, the one of Walter and her grandfather, taken all those years ago, before their final mission together. At the gravesite, in the soft autumn light, she walked forward and laid it gently against the polished wood of the casket. You kept the promise, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, for both of you. On his headstone, beneath Walter Reed's name and the years of his life, the town inscribed a single, powerful line. He didn't ask for it. They just knew. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives. The diner still serves the veteran special every Sunday, the smell of bacon and coffee still filling the air. But now, the corner table stays empty. A small, polished brass plaque is bolted to the wood, a quiet testament. It says, reserved in memory of Walter Reed. SEAL Team Bravo G7. Some men carry the mission long after the war ends. Tourists sometimes ask who he was, pointing to the plaque with curiosity. Locals just point to the sign outside and smile, a knowing, proud smile. Silent service way. Because around here, in Grand Steiner, some stories aren't shouted from the rooftops. They're carried, one quiet act at a time, one quiet man at a time, until the whole town remembers. And maybe, just maybe, the rest of us do too. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often, in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry.